everyone, welcome to my OCD history video. I know the setup is a little weird, but I cannot put holes in my wall, so I tried the different setups and this is the one that actually worked the best. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to break down the history that has been seen throughout the literature in OCD. Now, I'm not going to go over everything because a lot of the documentation is very repetitive and it seems to be almost the same types of themes or fears covering a certain amount of time. Now, before we go into the history, there is something we have to talk about, and that is, what is OCD? Now, all of the information I got making this came from a couple different things. It came from organizations, different research, meta-analysis, and systematic reviews, looking at the breakdown, the research they had from 1900, the anecdotes back in scripture they had hundreds of years ago, and what they see today. And all this leads to what this video is going to be about. So first of all, what is OCD? Okay, OCD is obsessive compulsive disorder. The D is very important because the Oxford definition of a disorder is something that affects your life 1 to 2 hours a day, your quality of life, your burden of income, and so on and so forth, and it usually is in a chronic nature. So it has two components, obsessions and compulsions. Now, there are people that say, that there is such thing as pure O, and that people just have obsessive thoughts and not compulsive behaviors. And this has been found to be not true because it's a disorder, and in order to have this disorder, you must have both categories met. So most of these compulsions, you're not any different if you have pure O, as they say. All of your compulsions are all internal and in your mind. They're just not physical, outward compulsions. So we have obsessions. What are obsessions? Obsessions can be broken down to a few things. Like myself, my obsessions are somatically based. They're based off sensations. I also have BDD, body dysmorphic disorder, which is also in the somatic category as hyperawareness. There's a chart I found that I did not break down when they looked at all of the OCD types of fears and then related them to the OCD related conditions, such as hoarding, such as impulsive gambling and spending and eating, and they kind of twine them together, and even though they're not OCD, they're kind of in the same genetic category they're coming to find out. And I'm not going to go over the genes, I'm not a geneticist, and to be completely honest, it's not the most practical thing. That's all you really need to know about that. So, as I said, somatic obsessions. We have other obsessions such as images, such as fear of harming someone, POCD, pedophilia OCD, existential OCD, magical thinking OCD, and all these different things, as we call themes, but we're kind of leaning towards something else, and they're just fears. They're just specific fears that you are afraid of, and since OCD is a disorder, it knows exactly what you are afraid of the most, and it locks to that fear. And that is what those obsessions are. And OCD can latch to about anything. We always joke and say if you became scared of caterpillars, we would call it caterpillar OCD. So the themes are kind of nonsensical, but I understand some of their perspectives about why they're still around, but it really just comes down to specific fears. Compulsions. Compulsions are still kind of misunderstood in the OCD community, people who do research, therapists alike, and laymen. So compulsions are used to decrease the anxiety from the consistency of the intrusive thoughts or the obsessions. Now, they're temporary. That's why I like to say that. The compulsion is a fake illusion. We do them in order to bring down this sense of fear that's not rational. So our compulsions tend to be irrational in a lot of ways, especially if you have, say, something like magical thinking and you have to say the number 4 22 times before you can open your door. Just a arbitrary example. Now, what can compulsions be, in part of compulsions? Well, you have physical and then which are outward compulsions, checking, washing your hands, going back, driving over the block, which is still checking. And then we have internal compulsions, almost like a thermostat, where you're checking, well, I didn't feel like this yesterday, but I feel worse today. And you're just constantly comparing in this loop that keeps you in that OCD cycle. And this is a major problem, especially with the internal compulsions. There's a lot of people that say OCD recovery is just the absence of anxiety, but still have obsessions or dealing with your panic attacks, and that's not what OCD recovery is. These people probably have a good understanding of what OCD recovery is, but the internal compulsions, unless you have someone that fully understands OCD, and in my opinion, there's probably less than 3 people on the whole entire planet that fully know how to get under your fears, probably less than 2. And that is how you're going to get underneath these fears, because you need to see the internal compulsions that you have. And those are probably the hardest to break, because you might say, like I said with Puro, I'm not checking, I'm not washing, but you're probably checking internally in your head and comparing your intrusive thoughts to the day before and so forth, which is a compulsion. So, risks. What are basically the consensus of risk factors for OCD? Remember, obsessive compulsive disorder. They think it's genetic and brain structure. I'm not going to go into the different areas of the brain. I just don't think it's necessary to talk about the thalamus or the prefrontal cortex or the orbital cortex. It's usually left for the researchers, and you don't need to understand that to recover. Your environment, that is huge. It's almost like a light switch the way chronic OCD turns on. You might have been suffering with OCD on and off for your whole entire life, but it really didn't turn on like a light switch until you had, say, a panic attack like I did, thinking about blinking. And that's a big problem. The diagnosis is always made in DX means diagnosis, TX means treatment. That's in doctor or medical terms. So usually by a mental health care professional. Now, do you need a diagnosis of OCD every time? No. If you've researched enough for yourself like I did, I never have been diagnosed with OCD by a mental health professional until I went afterwards and told them I had OCD. But once I knew the knowledge, I knew I had OCD, just from the intrusiveness of my thoughts and my repetitive behaviors and my black and white and stuff like that. Now, the prevalence is pretty interesting. They say about 2 million people in the United States of America have OCD, genetic disorder, whether that is in chronic format or not. 1 to 200 kids, and like I said, the population is 1.2% on average. Another interesting factor is statistically shown that 40 to 60% of people have some sort of scrupulosity, which I'm going to talk about soon when it comes to religion or moral value stuff that we see in different types of religion based on their very black and white traditions and their doctrines. And this can be very problematic if you have OCD. This is not to say that you can't have faith, but it is important if you're trying to recover from something like religious OCD to break things down through the teachings of, say, Dr. Albert Ellis, which I will go over at the end. So, before we go on this journey, I want to say that it was a very interesting experience going through and learning all this stuff. This stuff is very, very interesting to say the least. It's also very complex. It also makes you realize how fortunate you are to be living in a time like this where things weren't as bad. I mean, today we have it great. We can actually recover. You know, when you think about what I'm going to go through, you're going to realize that, wow, these people probably had it really tough. So let's break it down. Everything we have on OCD, mostly before 1900 or 1850, is all in, you don't want to call it research, but more just people talking about in autobiographies or scriptures written by people in the religious realm. So usually around the 12th century to the present. And I wanted to start with this quote because I thought it was an interesting quote from way back, hundreds of years ago. And it was someone who said they came out the other side of OCD. Imagine that, 800 years ago, coming out of OCD. And it said, for one would need to pass through to understand this martyrdom, was I think the words they used. And it took them 18 months. And that was really interesting because a lot of OCD people will tend to say, well, you don't understand. And they don't need to understand. But it is a very unique quote to show just the prevalence of despair it can cause on your life, especially back then when you could just be burned at the stake. So, from about the beginning of OCD to the 17th century and still up until the 18th century, we had scrupulosity, okay? Scrupulosity is almost another terminology for religious OCD. So religious morals obsessions, aka the sinner. And this was huge. Just to go a little bit off track, if you notice some of the themes that are really affecting societies today, they're built around what the societal standards are today. So if you're very, very scared of being judged and you have a thought about pedophilia, POCD might lock more today than it did, say, X amount of years ago. So where does this come from? Scrupulum, which is sharp stone, which was stabbing pain in the conscious. And this is what they thought back then. Now we got to remember, this is 600, 700, 800 years ago. Think about how we've made more technological advances in all fronts in the last 10 years, maybe even 5 years, than we have in the previous 2,000. So back then, this was the best of their knowledge. They didn't know any better. So, and it was hard to get past that. Once we got past, probably in the, I wrote 17th, but it's really 16th, 17th, 18th, and still used today. Melancholy is another name for persistent sadness or depression. So when you look throughout the history, you see different articles and texts written on both of these things. So I wanted to start with the Chancellor of the University of Paris, who was born from 1363 to 1421, and he was writing about that high-ranking people in society were very afraid of sin. Now, back in this time period, everything that we know of was related to religion. Everything that they were, their life was based off religion. Heaven, hell, angels, demons, crucifixion, everything. Everything was based off religion. No wonder why this was the main form of fears back in these time periods. So, and then you have Antonius of Florence, which was born around the same time. He was the first person to talk about maybe these fears are more baseless. And all throughout history, they couldn't figure out if this was maybe a disorder of intellect, maybe a disorder of free will, a disorder of emotions. Sigmund Freud really weighed in on this, said to Janet Pierre. So, and throughout history, the paradigm shifts, as they call it in some of the literature, started to shift in a couple hundred years, and just how we're in the paradigm right now of cognitive behavioral changes. In, say, 100 years ago, the paradigm shift was looking into the past, psychoanalytic behaviors from Sigmund Freud, the Austrian psychiatrist. So this was interesting. So 1577 to 1640, Robert Burton wrote on the anatomy of melancholy. So he wrote down what he thought was going on in society from this persistent sadness. And he talked about someone sitting in sermon or sitting in church, and they would have these intrusive thoughts come into their mind, but they were so afraid to act a certain way because they thought that damnation was going to happen to them. And people were starting to realize just how irrational these beliefs are, and they were really, really, really out of control at the time. But if you notice on this, and I'm about to move this out of the way, everything from this time period, from say, whatever you want to say, 12th century to 1700, but this 400 or 500 time frame is all based around scrupulosity. And then melancholy came later on, but it was based around religion. And that was the main original texts that came about when we look back in history. What is OCD? Where did this come from? So from here, move this out of the way. Yay! I wanted to talk about just how fortunate we are with this, and I'll move this up a little bit. Talk about the treatment then and the treatment we have now, okay? Interesting. When they first started to treat OCD, one of the main things they thought was going on was you had humors in your body. Okay, so basically yellow bile, blood, phlegm, and black bile. And what they worked was phlebotomy. So they would kind of drain certain humors, as they thought, to create a more emotional balance, which is very, very interesting. And today it sounds ludicrous to us, but remember, 100 years ago, arsenic was a medication. And they used to put metal spheres over people's heads and bash them with a hammer to cure migraines, which we now know vibration is probably not beneficial for that. So that was really interesting. They thought all of these humors controlled the soul. Now, we have asylums. Okay, at the time, 1700, 1800, some would say late 1800s, they thought OCD was, well, you were bewitched, you were insane, and they called them O's and C's, obsessions and compulsions, and they would just throw people in insane asylums. So imagine that. Imagine you have OCD. Everyone thinks you're crazy, and they're throwing you in an insane asylum. That is very, very, very frustrating, and I could almost say debilitating when you don't have any of the tools that we have today. Now, once we got to about the end of the 1800s, this is when the big man came on scene, Sigmund Freud, one of the most influential people in psychotherapy on earth. Up there with Dr. Albert Ellis. I think Dr. Albert Ellis is now number one. So he was very big into looking into the past. And he had this word, excuse my the way I pronounce this, but I think it's Zwangnerosis. And it was basically, he was the first person to talk about a maladaptive response. And this was the paradigm shift that we had for about 70 years. And we know today that looking into your past might have some benefit, but your activating event, say OCD, is not actually the main cause of your distress. It's your belief. And it's a maladaptive response system that we have going on, more than likely. But it doesn't mean you can't change this throughout OCD recovery. Now, I wanted to touch on Sigmund Freud a little bit because I think it's important. So like I said, he was an Australian psychoanalyst. He was an MD. So we have psychologists, which are PhDs or doctorates. And then we have an MD, who are medical doctor psychiatrists who can prescribe medication and so forth. So this is a very interesting and cool thing to see. In the UK, they thought this word meant obsession, and in the US, they thought this word meant compulsion. They had two different words for it, and then they came together, and that is where obsessive compulsive disorder came from. So very interesting. It kind of all wraps back to Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud was probably the first person to really talk about OCD as a full disorder. So he realized that there were temporary relief from the compulsions, and he knew they probably weren't leading to any good whatsoever. So in 1909, I'm not going to go into the details because it's pretty gruesome, but he talked about the Rat Man. Now, if you're interested in what the Rat Man is, just look up 1909, the Rat Man. But he realized that people were having very odd, irrational fears, and they didn't know why, but they knew there was something going on beneath the surface. This wasn't a normal fear. They couldn't stop thinking about them. And Sigmund Freud really did shape the way OCD was coming for about seven decades until the 60s and 70s, when the new paradigm shift, which we have today, seen the best outcomes in research, and that is the cognitive behavioral approaches going towards uncertainty, ERP, exposure response prevention, which I think was invented in the 70s as well. And there were two people I think it's really important to talk about when we talk about just how sad OCD is when there was no help. So, and what's dangerous about both of these gentlemen is they were both rich, and Howard Hughes was one of the richest people on earth. The movie The Aviator by Martin Scorsese, Leonardo DiCaprio predicted the film, or was the actor. His money was so high he could just keep himself in compulsion land, and no one knew. All his staff was helping him, but no one knew at the time. So how can you even be angry? They just didn't know. It's just, imagine what OCD recovery is going to be like in 50 years from now. They're going to think we're nuts. So Nikola Tesla, 1856 to 1943. Actually, interesting. That's a long life for back then. 1900, I believe the average life expectancy was 48. So it's pretty cool. Serbian inventor was a physicist. He was the person who invented the alternating current, as we know. I'm not a physicist. I don't know much about the alternating current, so I'll leave it at that. But what was cool was when he passed away, a lot of his works became classified. Lasers, x-rays, robotics, radar. The government made them classified, and we don't even know things today that could have been invented by him. I didn't write this down, but he had 700 patents. 700! People have a hard time having one patent. He had 700 of them. So, very interesting. Magical thinking and contamination OCD were probably his biggest things. So, I'm kind of going to read this off the board just because it's easier to read. But he was obsessed with the number 3. He would swim 33 laps in his pool, and if he lost count, he had to do it again to feel the correct feeling. He curled his toes 100 times each night before he went to sleep because he thought it dealt with brain stimulation. I didn't write this down as well. He also used to leave a building, turn to the right, do 3 laps to have a right feeling before he could enter the building. That's what OCD does. Magical thinking. We don't know what his fears were, but he was afraid of something. Maybe if he didn't do something 33 times, he would have a heart attack. He lived on suite 3327 on the 33rd floor of the New York hotel, counted his jaw movements, he stopped shaking hands, and he loved being alone. Something that we notice about OCD sufferers in the literature back hundreds of years ago, they like to be reclusive, and rightfully so. They're probably suffering so much They don't think anyone understands them. They think they're crazy. They think if they tell anyone, they're going to be bewitched and their life is over. So, like I said, what we are seeing here is classic magical thinking and contamination OCD, afraid of germs and so on and so forth. But to premise Howard Hughes, I don't think Nikola Tesla's, if I could imagine, his contamination OCD was as severe as Howard Hughes. So, we got Howard Hughes. Howard Hughes, born 1905 to 1976. He was an investor, a pilot, and very rich. One of the richest people in the world at the time. Excuse me. In 1920, he produced a bunch of really big Hollywood films, and he had RKO Studios, which he sold in 1955 to pursue his aviation career. Now, I kind of want to go back to Nikola Tesla because I forgot about this. Remember, the most common symptoms usually show in different things. You see different things. 19 years old, 22 to 25 years old. 75% of people show signs by the time they're 30, but it didn't hit him until he was 51, they say. Probably had OCD before that, but interesting to say that he really didn't start suffering until 51. And Howard Hughes was the same way. He had a tough childhood, and definitely he had a tough childhood, but we really didn't see those types of OCD tendencies really come out until later in his life. So as he got older, he really did become a recluse. He was reclusive, he was very eccentric. This is an interesting story. I think the hotel was the Desert Inn, but when he left the Desert Inn Hotel, the drapes had rotted through. He had not opened his drapes in who knows how long, and they actually had rotted through. He would burn his own clothes. He was addicted to codeine in the last, I think, 15 to 20 years of his life. When he passed away, he was very, very, very thin. It was very, very sad. And he would sleep naked with tissue boxes on his feet. Now, after he passed away, Raymond D. Flower did an autopsy on him, looked back in his history, see what was going on, and found that he had a really fearful childhood. His mom was very overprotective and was always maybe instilling fear in him, not out of malicious intent, but just out of maybe she had some OCD as well, and she just thought what she was doing was the best for her child. Now, this is very important. There are a lot of people that say that because Howard Hughes and Nikola Tesla were so OCD, it helped with their creativity. Absolutely not true. There is benefits from going through OCD recovery. There are no benefits of OCD. And you see videos online, the benefits of having OCD. OCD is it was a disorder. The World Health Organization, until not that long ago, rated it in the top 10 most debilitating conditions on Earth. Top 10. And for a while, they wanted to move it to the top 5. So if it got in the top 5, you think there's any benefits from that condition? It's in the 5 most burden-informed illnesses on Earth? No, there are no benefits from OCD. It completely decreases your quality of life and can completely destroy your life if you don't know how to go through with the recovery process. Like none of these people did that I've mentioned so far because there was no tools back then. They have phlebotomy. They would drain your blood. Think about that. No cognitive changes. So that's very important to think about. Anytime anyone says to you that there's benefits of OCD, explain to them how there isn't, and if they don't want to listen, just walk the other way. So I didn't write on this board, but I did want to talk about, I'll move this a little bit, Albert Ellis. So Albert Ellis basically is one of the most influential people in psychotherapy ever, okay? So he created CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, and he realized that people, we have ABC. Your activating event, oh, and by the way, this wasn't geared towards OCD, but we now realize that this is probably the best form to help someone fully recover and get underneath their fears, and not so much the Sigmund Freud thinking of looking into your past. So we know that you have an A, B, and a C. You have an activating event, you have a belief, and you have a C, your emotional consequences. Depression, chronic sadness, chronic anxiety, and so forth. We have been taught in society that our A is the main driver of C. Interesting. I like to use this. If you take 100 people and they all get into a T-boned accident at 15 miles an hour, they're all going to react different ways. They all got hit at 15 miles an hour. They all got hit directly in the same spot. But they all have different perspectives. That shows you right there that your activating event is not the cause of your C. It's not like it doesn't contribute to it, because it does contribute a little bit, but it's not the driving factor. If you got in that car accident and you said, I hate this person, this should not happen to me, you're going to be way more upset with way more emotional distress. But if you said, life's just the way it is, just life, I get a new door, I'm not dead, my passenger's alive, wow, my kids are safe in the back. That is the difference right there. Think about that. Rewind this video and watch that, because that is the key to all human misery, your perspective and your belief. The trauma can have some importance, but it is not the driving factor of your misery. And people still believe that, upwards of 95%. So that's a problem. And this is why we approach this. So it would be really interesting. I'm not a mental health counselor. If I would go back in time and I could talk to either of these two with the knowledge I have right now, I think in 5 minutes, like Rob says as well, I could totally change their outlook if they wanted to listen. Make them realize they're not alone. These people probably felt so alone. Think about how lucky we are. Everything I've talked about. We have the OCD community, okay? Whether it's Rob's or not. We have different approaches that work. Moving with uncertainty, ERP, getting underneath your fears, and all these other things. So we're in a very good place. A very good place. Who knows where we'll be in 20 years from now? You might be able to recover from OCD with Neuralink, like Elon Musk was talking about. It's an extreme example, but it might happen. Who knows? So we at least have the tools today to recover that people didn't have before. And I know I am super fortunate to have that, because my life, I thought, was over. And it's not over, okay? It's not, because I'm very thankful for what I've gone through. Going through this history project was one of the coolest things that could have ever happened to me. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you have a terrific day.